Hello Chickadees and welcome to a new video. Today I wanted to share with you the process of making some gloves for my prior attire ensemble. I started by taking apart an existing pair of gloves and using the pieces to make a pattern. I used the pinprick technique to mark the seam lines of each piece. I then drew across these marks to create the initial shape, and then used my quilting ruler to mark a 1/8 of an inch seam allowance around each piece. Once each pattern piece was cut out, I made my first mock-up. It was immediately obvious that I would need to add more ease into the pieces as the original gloves were made of a slightly stretchy fabric. I made 3 mock-ups until I got to a version that I was happy with. I was quite rough with the mock-up, so there were some twists in the fingers where the front and back of the main section weren't lined up properly. Now I was ready to make it from my silk. At the last minute I decided it was probably a good idea to line the gloves. I cut the pieces from my cotton lawn that I used for the petticoat combinations and basted them to the silk. I then ran a narrow zigzag stitch around each piece, which reduces the amount of fraying. It won't stop it completely, but since silk will fray if you simply look at it funny, any help to control the teeny seams was appreciated. I then cut each piece from the silk, getting as close to the cotton layer as possible. I marked the seam allowance around the thumb. The side seam on the thumb piece was the only thing that was sewn by machine, everything else was done by hand. I have an appreciation for people who enjoy large amounts of hand sewing, but it's something I never got into. I ran a line of basting stitches 1/8 of an inch around the finger seam, and then cut down the marked line. I apologise for the lack of focus in this clip, but I hope you can get the gist of what I'm doing. At the bottom of this line I made small snips radiating out to the basting stitch to allow the finger pieces to be manipulated easier when stitching. I only cut each finger as I was working on it, again to reduce fraying and working the fabric too much. I started with the palm side and attached all the inserts with the same 1/8 of an inch seam allowance. I started at the bottom of each finger, working my way to the top. Once this was done, I then whip stitched down the allowances, catching only the cotton layer. I have considered doing a top stitch, but I thought the whip stitch would be slightly less fiddly. Once the other side had been attached, I stitched down the seam with the help of a mannequin finger placed inside the glove, giving me something to hold the fabric taut over. You could use something like a wooden dowel, but just be careful of your fashion fabric, especially if you are using something expensive. Then I marked the opening onto the wrong side of the glove in the shape of a narrow diamond. Whilst looking through some inspiration pictures, I came across a rather fun closure, which had offset buttons and a ribbon, which I wanted to try. I placed a square of silk on the right side of the glove and stitched around the marked opening. This was then cut open. On the right side, this square of fabric was then turned through the hole to the wrong side and stitched down with a slip stitch. I did baste the edge temporarily to stop it flipping back through. Then it was time for the closure. I originally placed the buttons in an offset pattern and attached a ribbon, but no matter how I tried to wind the ribbon, the split just kept bunching and sort of collapsing on in itself. So I decided to go with buttons and loops instead. In most extant examples, the wrist of the glove has a bit of ease in it, so buttonholes can be created which overlap the button side, cinching in that part of the glove. Alas, I had already got rid of that ease, so I had to settle for thread loops instead, which is a piece of thread looped around 3 or 4 times, attached to the glove, and then knots are created along the length of this loop. This then gets sewn down to create a hard-wearing button loop. For my first attempt, I think they came out wonderfully. They may be a tad short for a ball, and my second glove is definitely better than my first one, but I would definitely consider making more. Now that the ball has been postponed, I may remake them with buttonholes for next time, and I would love to attempt them in leather. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed, then please consider liking and subscribing, and check out the description for other ways to support me.